Great.
It's going to be the best talk of the quarter. I'm missing all kinds of people. I wonder why. We'll start in a couple minutes.
Yes, whenever you want.
So there's two more. This is week 7. No, week 8, right? So we have 2 more talks and they're both going to be remote. The last one is actually in Denver or Boulder. He was going to come, but decided that he's been traveling too much. So the last 2 are going to be remote. One of them's in LA, another marine carbon capture company. And then Matt Long is working on how to quantify the marine carbon capture part, I think, and he's a very engaging speaker. I think that should be really interesting too. So, that's another person. And those of you that are in 475, I'm not going to be here on Thursday, but I have someone who's going to facilitate the peer review of the one-pagers. I hope you get them in tomorrow night so that you'll get some feedback from your classmates. And we're also going to have a short talk on marine cloud writing. And it's been in the news. I told her to just talk to you for 15 minutes or so. I think it should be pretty interesting. They're really in the throes of it. So I'll see if I can find the news article again and I'll post it in the module, but it's quite controversial. And anyway, I've been, okay, so yeah.
When is the green cloud writing discussion?
Well, it's just for the 475 students. Yeah, just a short thing. And then on the following week, Alex is gonna come and talk to you, Alex Gagnon, who forgot that he was giving the seminar. He's gonna come and talk to you about what it's like working at starting a startup in this space, just an informal discussion. So he was interested in meeting you all and talking about that a bit. So I think we'll have some special things the next couple of weeks as you're finishing other projects. Okay, any other questions, housekeeping? Okay, so today we have Sunita Guzman coming. I'm really happy. She talked to us last year too, so I'm sure they're not many repeat here, but I'm glad all of you came today because it's a really interesting talk and an interesting perspective, especially after Kendall's talk, which I also thought was one of the highlights of the quarter. A different way of thinking about the interactions of nature, people, and sort of climate solutions adaptation. So take it away, Sunita.
Well, thanks, Lynn, for inviting me back. It was fun last year, and I'm sure it'll be fun this year. So how many of you are completely new to the topic of coastal nature-based solutions? Oh, good. Nobody. How many of you do research on coastal nature-based solutions? A tentative yes? Okay, so it sounds like everybody's kind of in between. You're not new to the topic, but maybe you don't work on it, with the one exception. All right, well, I guess first maybe I'll say a little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture. We're in Gould Hall over there. You probably don't know where we are. We're a small college, the College of Built Environments, which has architecture, planning, real estate construction management. Landscape architects participate a lot in the design and construction of coastal nature-based solutions. Also, I'll show you some projects that are well known where landscape architects are involved, but also engineers and ecologists build nature-based solutions without designers like landscape architects involved. Where we typically get involved are projects that have a much more public sort of public-facing side and have social benefits as well. That's usually where you'll find landscape firms. So I will talk more about those kinds of projects than the purely ecological, that's more kind of science-driven or exclusively science-driven types of projects. So as you know, and I'll go over this pretty quickly, nature-based solutions are a response to all of the climate threats that we're seeing on the coast. So that includes sea level rise, of course, which is a very long-term phenomenon, which some places are experiencing very acutely now. But other places like here on in the coast of Washington, we are not seeing sea level rise as drastically as other parts of the US. So it's differential, the response to sea level rise across the US, but nonetheless, it's going to be important for every location. Another important thing that is maybe less recognizable than sea level rise are higher peak tides, which are sometimes called sunny day flooding in places like Florida, which is where this image is from, which is that as sea levels rise, the tidal range is also changing and moving along with that mean sea level that is also rising. So we are seeing higher peak tides that are producing flooding, particularly in low-lying areas like Florida, Louisiana, and places like that. There's of course more intense storms. So as waves are battering the coast more strongly than before, there's a lot more coastal erosion. So flooding and erosion are major problems that cities and undeveloped areas are facing and wanting to respond to with some kind of infrastructural response. Another perhaps less well-known issue related to sea level rise is groundwater rise. Have any of you heard of groundwater rise in coastal areas? One person. So as the sea rises, groundwater is also rising with it. And in low-lying coastal areas like San Francisco Bay, for instance, this is projected to be a major issue. Groundwater is also rising at the same time. So a lot of our infrastructure in coastal zones, low-lying coastal zones, is going to be in the way of a rising groundwater table, which is going to cause a lot of problems, like mobilizing pollutants that are in the soil in contaminated areas, but also it's going to make our infrastructure less resilient because there will be days that it might be underwater. Our infrastructure isn't completely waterproof. There's a lot of leaks in pipes, and so drainage is going to be more difficult in areas that we have groundwater rise. But mostly the mobilization of pollutants is a major issue related to groundwater rise. So we've had habitat loss for a long time, mostly driven by our own actions in building development on the coast, building wetlands, for example, and building on top of them. But sea level rise on its own is going to erode a lot of our natural ecosystems. So this is another issue that is going to exacerbate climate change because we're depending more and more now on the shoreline protection benefits of dunes, wetlands, and other coastal ecosystems, but they themselves are being threatened. And so we're not going to have that natural infrastructure that we used to have. This is from a recent IPCC report about the different threats to different coastal systems. So our typical response, at least historically, to these issues, which haven't been as acute as they are now, although there's certainly been strong storms and coastal erosion in the past, our historic response has been to build hard infrastructure. And this is a picture from Galveston, which is famous for a seawall that was constructed in the either late 1800s or early 1900s. There was a big hurricane that came through Galveston and caused widespread destruction and loss of life. I don't remember the figure, but hundreds, if not thousands of people died in that hurricane. And that mobilized a response to build this giant seawall. You can see there's a man standing on top of it, and it is this structure here, most of which is covered by the beach. And this was a huge monumental project in its time. We don't, at least in the US, do this scale of projects that frequently anymore. But historically, building hard infrastructure like seawalls was the way that we tried to combat these kinds of problems, because at the time, particularly when in the turn of the century, we knew a lot less about environmental science, about the way nature works. Humanity had a kind of false confidence in its ability to manage risk. And we thought that we could actually dominate nature. And by building a seawall like this, we'd be fine, and nothing, it would sort of protect us from anything. But of course, we're seeing that that's not the case, and seawalls fail all the time, in part because they're getting old. Like the Galveston seawall was built over 100 years ago. But also we're getting larger storms. And so this hard infrastructure that we used to rely on or thought was reliable is becoming less so. Plus, it's also incredibly costly to build. Nowadays, it can cost many billions of dollars to build seawalls of that magnitude. And we have to keep building them bigger and bigger as sea levels rise. And so people are asking a lot of questions about, well, what do we do now, given that our historic response is challenging from both a risk management and a financial point of view, and not to mention the environmental degradation that building seawalls, for example, causes, in that it obliterates whatever ecosystem was there. It causes a lot of erosion in front of it because it reflects wave energy. It can also change sediment transport along the shoreline. So things that you all probably do study already. Here's an image of that. So when you build a seawall, because it's hard, it just sort of bounces back the waves, and that reflection of wave energy usually causes some scour down here at the toe of the sail. So now we've kind of developed a spectrum of solutions ranging from the classic seawall, which is considered gray infrastructure or hard infrastructure. There's a lot of terms for anywhere along the spectrum, to the other side, which is often called green or soft or nature-based solutions, being the restoration of natural ecosystems. And there's a lot of stuff in between where it kind of gets fuzzy, where you draw the line between green or gray, what is natural or what isn't. And this is a theme that we'll return to a few times in this talk. But know that there's a broad suite of solutions ranging from the pure restoration of habitats to the things in between requires some kind of minimal infrastructure to 100% infrastructure, like bulkheads, seawalls, revetments that are hard, immobile, costly to build, usually fairly large, and are meant to be sort of static. So I mentioned that there's a lot of terminology. There's really no single definition for nature-based solutions. It's a kind of boundary object. Have any of you heard that term, boundary object? Yeah, do you want to tell us what that means?
Yeah, so it's a science studies term where that refers to any sort of term or object or idea that sort of connects two different fields or two different like communities of practice, and it might mean something different to each of them.
Yes, excellent, thank you. I'm so glad you had a textbook definition for boundary object, perfect. So yes, nature-based solutions is one of those fuzzy terms that means different things to different people. And the good part of that is that it allows collaboration, because two people who are interested in nature-based solutions get excited by working on nature-based solutions, but they might not approach it in exactly the same way. And so the reality is that it is a fuzzy concept. People define it in different ways. And there's a whole host of associated terms that for some people mean the same thing, for other people mean something slightly different. So for example, you'll see living shorelines, which is a very American term. Ecosystem-based adaptation is used more often in Europe to mean something very similar to nature-based solutions and living shorelines. Ecological engineering is another, field really, but also practice. Blue infrastructure, which refers to kind of green or soft approaches, but specifically in watery kind of landscapes. And then I mentioned already green soft infrastructure. So there's a lot of terms, and you'll probably encounter all of them at some point in your careers. And I mean, it's just worth asking maybe the person you're talking to, or clarify for yourself what you mean by each kind of approach. But it is fuzzy, and it's not like there's a very clear sort of top-down definition that everyone must adhere to. It's something that's kind of loose and dependent on context. So on the super green side of the spectrum, we have things like habitat restoration. So this is a picture of a coastal wetland restoration project, somebody doing some plant plugs, so planting this wetland and hoping that a lot of that vegetation stays and grows. And they can also mean dune restoration. So dunes are a really important ecosystem for buffering wave energy as well. And so there's a lot of dune restoration projects, which sometimes involve constructing a new dune altogether or installing something called sand fences, which allow the wind to deposit sand on the dune more efficiently than without the sand fences. It can also include replanting. So these are very ecological approaches to nature-based solutions. Then kind of in the middle, that middle zone, there are emerging approaches such as dynamic revetments. And dynamic revetments, this is actually a project that I'm working on at the moment down in Willapa Bay, which is the Pacific coast of the state of Washington. The map there doesn't show you the full context, but this is Willapa Bay, and Tokeland is this point here, and North Cove is about where the black rectangle is, and that's the picture we're showing here. So in this area of the coastline, the community, which was very worried about erosion, they've been losing miles of land, in fact, since the early 1900s. Not so much due to climate change, but because of changing sediment transport due to, I think, damming of the Columbia River. So they've been losing a crazy amount of shoreline, and they've been very worried about it for a long time. And they have decided to build dynamic revetments in this area, and they've actually been working really well. A dynamic revetment, unlike a traditional revetment, which is really huge, hulky rocks that are placed on the beach and or the coast, and they're not intended to move. A dynamic revetment uses smaller cobble that's, maybe about this big, usually kind of rounded, and it's deposited on the coast, and it's allowed to be moved by the waves. So that's the dynamic part of revetment. The idea is that it will find a kind of balance seasonally between the wave energy and the location of the cobbles and the sand that gets deposited on them. So it's a sort of approach that's very responsive to the changes in wave energy wherever that location is. And how much cobble you need, exactly what size, like these are things that actually engineers are working on right now to study dynamic revetments better. So here, there's the pre-construction picture is what the shoreline at Willapa Bay looked like. It was basically a scarp that was maybe 5 feet down to the beach, and it was continually being eroded. They deposited a bunch of cobble right in front of the scarp. And then in this particular location, they built something that they lovingly call a wave tripper, which is another sort of mound of cobbles some distance away from the original shoreline here. And the idea is that as a wave hits the wave tripper, it's going to lose some energy and wash over the wave tripper. And that loss of energy is going to allow some sediment to deposit here on the beach. And over time, the profile of the beach will change. And now I'll show you what it looks like today in winter and summer. So in winter, of course, the conditions are a little bit smaller because there's net sediment loss in winter compared to summer where there's net gain. But overall, now that it's been a few years, and I think maybe 5 to 10 years since they built that dynamic revetment, which is still here. So I know it's hard to see with the projector, but here's the cobble and the wave tripper that was originally built. Now they're actually both buried. There's been so much deposition of sand that you don't see the cobbles anymore. You have no idea that under your feet there's a bunch of cobble. In the winter, it's still buried, although they're much closer to the surface. The beach loses some thickness in the winter because there is net sediment loss, but over the long term, so at the scale of multiple years, the beach is actually growing in width. So it is getting a bit wider and wider over time. So it's like, 2 steps back in winter, 5 steps forward in summer. So it is growing over time. But it does change seasonally. So in winter, it's the beach elevation lowers and it's not as wide, and in summer it widens and it gets thicker. Dune grass has actually managed to establish itself here, and along with that, there's important nesting habitat for endangered birds that has now taken place. And because the beach is growing, people are enjoying the beach access more, and there's clamming that happens here and some unruly beach activities I've heard from the locals. don't appreciate outsiders coming in with like four-wheel vehicles and anyway. There's some conflicts now that the beach is so attractive. But we are, myself and my research assistant are working on these graphics for the community to help them explain how well their dynamic revetment has been working, both to other community members, but also to state and federal agencies that they want to get funding from to build larger dynamic revetments in other parts of the shoreline. So we're supporting them with these graphics that show this seasonal change and the processes that drive the benefits of dynamic revetments, because it's kind of hard to explain to someone, especially a community member, that even though the beach looks like this in winter, it's actually working. You have to really tell the whole annual story and the difference between winter and summer and how it looked like before to help somebody understand that because these are dynamic natural systems that change over time, it's not as simple as the seawall, which is just so obvious. You can see it, it doesn't change. People can kind of understand it very easily. These kind of systems are harder to understand, especially to non-scientists and members of the public. So that is one challenge of nature-based solutions. So if you go into practice as a scientist or engineer and you are working on these kinds of things, communicating to the public is sometimes a challenge because you have to tell this slightly more complicated story about, wave energy and sediment and seasonal change over time and all that. But it is possible, and this is what we're trying to do in this particular project. But dynamic revetments, they're still on the greener side of nature-based solutions for sure, but they do require that you deposit large volumes of cobble in the coastline that you're implementing this in. Then there are other approaches more in the nearshore area like reef balls, and these are special concrete kind of structures that are for the kind of establishment of a coral reef or oyster bed or any kind of sort of mollusks that attach themselves to structures. So the reef balls are specially designed for that, and I think there's companies that specialize, maybe some of you know better than I do, that specialize in different designs for things like reef balls. And I can just contract out a particular design and someone to come install them for you. So in this image, you see that there's kind of there's been a linear construction of these. So they're clearly trying to establish a kind of front of this nearshore environment that's going to, again, buffer wave energy before it actually hits the coast. And so in the nearshore environment, a lot of nature-based solutions are about either promoting the growth of seagrasses or oyster beds or coral reefs, because those are all ecosystems that are buffering wave energy due to the frictional effects of just being a physical thing in the water. But that's another set of approaches to restore the nearshore environment to again buffer wave energy. So the most famous project, I think, at least in the US, of a reef ball kind of approach is the Living Breakwaters project in New York. Have any of you heard of this project? No? Okay. So Living Breakwaters, and this is done by a landscape architecture firm called Scape, who's led by Kate Orff. And she had an interview in the New Yorker not that long ago, maybe a year or two ago. So she is very well known, and this project is well known, at least on the East Coast, maybe better than the West Coast. It's a project that is currently under construction. I think they're finishing fairly soon. And it's off Staten Island in New York, which is one of the New York boroughs. And it's a series of oyster habitats that have been constructed offshore to buffer wave energy and protect the Staten Island shoreline. This project was born, well, it was born earlier than Hurricane Sandy, but Hurricane Sandy really prompted the actual construction of this idea because Staten Island, along with many other areas of New York, suffered tremendous damage under Hurricane Sandy in 2011, I believe, was when Hurricane Sandy hit. There was a lot of devastation in the region, and subsequently HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Federal Agency, released a lot of money for projects in the New York region that would achieve coastal resiliency. And through that process, which was called Rebuild by Design, it was actually a design competition where landscape architects, engineering firms, and other consultants collaborated as teams to develop projects in different parts of the New York region. And the Living Breakwater project was one of several. It wasn't the only project in Rebuild by Design. And it was funded by HUD. So in the end, they picked some winners and gave, I don't remember the figure, but they released several billions of dollars for projects to actually get constructed. It was kind of meant to be a sort of seed grant, pilot grant. And so a few of these projects are actually being built. Living Breakwaters is one of them. Another one, which I won't talk about, is the Big U. Have any of you heard of the Big U? And so that's a project for Lower Manhattan, which is essentially kind of building up the elevation of the lower part of Lower Manhattan to again buffer storm surge and waves. That project has changed a lot since its original iteration, and Rebuild by Design has actually become very controversial with the local community for reasons that are for another lecture. But this project, I think, has maybe been one of the most successful of the Rebuild by Design competition. But the idea was actually proposed much earlier in 2010 in a very famous exhibition, well, famous in the design and planning world, which is the world that I come from, at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, had an exhibition called Rising Currents, which was about coastal resiliency. And in this exhibition, Kate Orff, who again is the principal of this landscape firm, proposed, I don't have an image of her proposal, but she proposed this idea of using oysters and oyster reefs as a coastal protection mechanism. And maybe that had been proposed before, perhaps by engineers and scientists, but I think it hit a more sort of public imagination with this exhibition, which brought this idea to a general public. And what is also kind of special about the Living Breakwaters project is that New York has a cultural history of the oysters. So Hudson Bay, that region used to have really rich oyster beds, and there was a cultural and economic history to oyster harvesting. But post-industrialization, the waters became too polluted, and oysters, I believe, were either harvested to extirpation or were or just died out of the pollution. So there's really not a lot of oysters, if any, in the New York waters today. And so this project also appealed to the cultural legacy of oysters in New York. So it wasn't purely a kind of technical scientific project. It also had this kind of emotional appeal to the past. So the project was part of, well, the design came out of a lot of modeling that was done by consultants to study where exactly, what direction waves were coming, what percentage of time, so that they could figure out what angle to put the new oyster reefs in. So there were a lot of modeling studies that went into it, and they ultimately decided on the configuration that you see here. So they have these set in these specific locations, and there's a channel here for navigation that has to be protected, so nothing can be built in this channel, which has really large ships coming in and out of it. And then I believe there's a small shoreline restoration zone that's part of the project as well. But the structures are kind of interesting. So they are these sort of fingers. Well, it's a central berm that's constructed, which has these fingers that go into the water that are using a special kind of ecological concrete. I don't know much about it, but it's supposed to kind of promote the growth of oysters adhering to it. And I assume that the shape of these fingers and the textures they have are also kind of optimized for oysters establishing themselves on it. And the idea is that the oysters would sort of populate and start to grow on top of and really take over these fingers and the part of this berm that is actually underwater. And that it would create a bit much bigger, bulkier structure once the oysters are all over it. And that's gonna buffer storm surge. So here are other renderings of what these berms with the fingers could look like, some details about the construction. I think actually there's a live webcam of the construction or a construction page from, I think, the state. So if you Google it, if you're interested in this project and want to know like exactly where they are on the construction process, that information is accessible. Here's a construction picture from a long time ago. I think they're sort of putting together these concrete kind of, I don't know what to call them, sort of bowls, which I think are also designed for the oyster propagation. There are some uncertainties with this project though, so it hasn't been completed or it's about to be completed, but we will have to see whether or not or to what extent oysters establish themselves on the structure. Its measure of success is that it becomes a healthy, vibrant, and hopefully really prolific oyster reef system. And if it doesn't, and it may not, due to, for example, ocean acidification, might start to degrade the integrity of the oyster reef. And that could be a failure in the end. So with a lot of nature-based solutions, because we are new, at least in the dominant Western science world, we're new to nature-based solutions. There are some uncertainties about how well they will perform and also for how long they will perform, because we do try to model for future conditions, but there's so much uncertainty about future conditions, we can't be completely sure how our interventions will perform. And because they're natural, there are so many interactive effects. So I know more about wetlands than oyster reefs, but in wetlands, for example, people worry not just about sea level rise and wave energy and whether a wetland can keep up with those natural forces, but also the change in temperatures because of warming. So will wetland plants, which are so necessary for a wetland to exist as an ecosystem, will they be able to survive just even in hotter temperatures or with more carbon dioxide in the air or with more saline and acid waters? So it's not just about the direct, the more obvious climate impacts like sea level rise, but also these other kind of cascading effects of climate change that could be what affect projects more than what we actually modeled for. So there's individual projects like living breakwaters and even much smaller projects that are being done that are nature-based solutions, but there's also really large projects that involve nature-based solutions as well. And I know Kendall last time talked about Louisiana, so I'm gonna go a bit faster in the Louisiana section, but I wanna point out that places like Louisiana actually have a whole coastal master plan, which includes nature-based solutions and gray infrastructure for the entire delta of Louisiana. And it's I think estimated to be about $11 billion to build this, probably more. Once it's actually fully built out. And that the coastal master plan is in part a response to Hurricane Katrina. So again, oftentimes we respond after disasters, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. A lot of people point out that we should be more proactive, but honestly, for political reasons, it's often much easier to respond to a disaster than to preempt a disaster, unfortunately. And Katrina was in part so devastating for Louisiana because Louisiana has lost a lot of its wetlands, and Kendall probably covered this, so I won't go into it too much, but there's been a lot of land loss in Louisiana. And so part of the Coastal Master Plan has been to rebuild some of those wetlands. One of the reasons that there's been a lot of wetland loss is because the Mississippi River has been leveed on both sides. And so it used to deposit a lot of sediment to create this delta, which it had been doing for thousands of years, but we have stopped that process. And that's part of why the wetlands have been literally washed away. And also the oil and gas industry with its construction of pipelines and rigging or whatever it is where they actually pump oil out has also chopped up this landscape a lot, which has degraded wetlands even further. So these are some of the approaches in the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. So they are planning everything from more levees, floodgates, so kind of hard infrastructure, to policies. So buyouts, for example, is a policy where a local government, usually with money from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, will buy properties that are in a flood zone, and those people will move somewhere else. So those are non-structural approaches, not considered nature-based solutions, but often implemented in tandem, or we hope that they would be because they're a good complement. And then on the more natural side, so the super green part of the spectrum, of course, marsh creation and ridge restoration. So these kind of high areas in amongst marshlands is what they call ridges. So restoring those. What's interesting about marsh creation in this context is that because they need so much sediment to create these marshes, a lot of marsh creation is created with really big infrastructure. So they actually dredge sediment from nearby and with big barges come and sort of pump sediment all across a new landscape to create wetlands. So it's again, this theme that we'll continually return to of what exactly is natural or not in nature-based solutions. This is creating a new ecosystem, but it entails a lot of technology and infrastructure to do that. There's probably a large carbon footprint to using a barge that dredges sediment that then pumps it, and there's also a tractor kind of moving things around. So the picture gets kind of complicated, right? When you really start to think about how some of these nature-based solutions are actually built. And then there's also what they call land bridges, which I think are intended to connect habitats together. There are also, this is another big infrastructural approach, is what they call sediment diversion. So because the Mississippi is leveed on both sides, and that's part of the reason why sediment, well, that is the reason why sediment isn't being deposited in the delta. They're actually creating breaks in the river to divert sediment to another part of the delta. So they create this cut here, and this is a new channel that is then allowing sediment to deposit over here. So again, this is a pretty big infrastructural move because this is the Mississippi and there's large levees on either side. This, I think, is meant to be sort of able to be opened and closed. So it's not just a kind of new river corridor that's being established, it's an infrastructural corridor. And this approach has been controversial for social reasons in that there's, where they have proposed these are places where there's existing communities who have pushed back against having to give up their lands for these sediment diversion projects. Other approaches, I'll just keep going for the sake of time. This is more about the sediment diversion. So here, this is more of a plan view of one of those projects that is cutting through some Black communities and who have really pushed back against the project, not just on the grounds that their lands are being lost, but also that they have a fishing culture that will also be impacted. So it's more about cultural practices and lifeways that are also going to be affected because the application of sediment in this area is expected to harm fish and dolphins that this community relies upon for their economic and social practices. So the coastal restoration in Louisiana, this master plan, which is driven by the state, has had a lot of critiques in being a very kind of top-down approach that is guided by cost-benefit analyses, which are kind of deemed to be objective ways of making decisions about what to build, but there's been a lot of good arguments for why cost-benefit analyses are not really a very equitable or even holistic way of judging whether something is worth doing or not. And the social pushback has been a lot around the displacement of particularly Black and Indigenous communities in southern Louisiana and how they will not only lose property, but also their cultural practices that are very intrinsically tied to land and water in this area. So it's been controversial, in short. And the questions that people are asking is again about the carbon footprint. So given that a lot, even on the nature-based solution side of the coastal master plan, those are the way that they're doing nature-based solutions is using a lot of infrastructure, a lot of technology, a lot of heavy lifting. What's going to be the carbon footprint, and is it actually going to pan out in the end? Building these new wetlands, which we might lose anyway in a short amount of time, just because Louisiana is so low in elevation and it's in a major hurricane corridor. So how long are these wetlands going to last? What did it take to build them, both socially, environmentally, financially? So there's a lot of questions around Louisiana's approach. So to summarize some of the key issues, I think because nature-based solutions is this boundary object, this fuzzy concept, what truly counts as nature and natural is very ambiguous and really kind of up to whatever actor is implementing nature-based solutions to decide. And often it can be used as greenwashing, quite frankly, or it can be, a very earnest approach to doing nature-based solutions. But I think that one of the key takeaways that I want to give to you is that just like we critique hard infrastructure now, knowing all of its downsides, we should also be critical about nature-based solutions because they can be implemented in much the same top-down technocratic kind of ways as any of our other infrastructure, as seawalls, as highways, as all these other large projects that we've done before. Nature-based solutions aren't inherently better, aren't automatically better. They can be better, but we really have to interrogate how they were designed, planned, implemented. So it's about sort of really thinking very carefully about what nature-based solutions means, what it's actually trying to do. So kind of that aside, there are still some really good questions that remain to be answered about the performance of nature-based solutions over time. So there's just so much we don't know in science because nature-based solutions are relatively new. We haven't been monitoring nature-based solutions for decades. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about how they will fare under climate change. So it's not to say that therefore we shouldn't do them, but just that there's a lot of uncertainty in the design stage about, how high should we elevate this wetland or how big should we make it? Well, you can model, but there's still going to be some measure of uncertainty. And then I guess related to the political question is just asking what nature-based solutions is really for. And a lot of people who embrace nature-based solutions as an opportunity to do transformational work in the way that our society relates to nature. Well, I should say that there is a group of people, practitioners, scholars, members of the public who see nature-based solutions as a way to do transformational change in our society. But there's also those who use nature-based solutions as a way to kind of just reinforce existing inequalities or existing top-down ways of doing things. And so you'll find both camps. And that's why it's important for each of you to really think critically about why you're building nature-based solutions if you end up in that line of work. Why are you doing it? What benefit does it truly have? Who might be harmed by a nature-based solution, which is theoretically possible. So it's just continuing to ask ourselves, are we doing, just because we're using nature now, are we really doing anything differently? Or are we just continuing to use the same processes we had before, but now with a different sort of ingredient than in the past? There's also questions about whether nature-based solutions are inherently anthropocentric, this way of framing nature as a kind of instrument for our needs is also a critique that's been had about nature-based solutions, particularly from indigenous communities, but also from other Western lines of thinking. So are we building nature-based solutions like the Living Breakwaters project is very much designed for our shoreline protection benefit? Are we, how do we think about the oyster itself in that project? Do oysters want to live there? Will they be happy there? Will they actually thrive in that environment? So there's a lot of interesting philosophical questions, and I think maybe also moral and ethical questions in our use and our framing of nature-based solutions. So going back to the transformational question, I think if we were doing nature-based solutions in a more transformational way, we would also be thinking more seriously about non-human needs and non-human interests in our design of nature-based solutions. All right, so I think this is the last slide. So just to leave you with maybe some takeaways for practice, I suppose, study and practice. So at least from the world that I come from, which very much thinks about science and society together, we promote thinking less about kind of technological fixes, which are usually very narrow in scope. There's one problem and one solution, and we're just kind of looking for the solution that fixes our one problem. It's really about stepping back and looking at the whole social ecological system together as a whole. Okay, we have a flooding problem, yes, but who's being affected by that problem? Why are they affected by the problem? What's the history? What's the context? How is that risk going to change over time? So really thinking about the picture in multiple dimensions instead of as a single problem that needs to be solved, because usually the narrow kind of one problem way of thinking about things tends to produce solutions that are very confined and will ultimately fail. So thinking about social issues, economic issues, ecological issues in the solution is part of thinking more as a problem, as a system, as opposed to a kind of one isolated kind of thing. And along with that, a line of thinking that I think is more prominent in academia right now is thinking about relational approaches. So thinking less about a solution, but really how does an intervention change our relationship to nature and to non-humans? So thinking about changing our relationships more than implementing a solution is a subtle framing perhaps, but is more directed towards our changing perhaps our culture ultimately, rather than just building something and allowing ourselves to stay the same as a society. The second point is about ontological pluralism. Has anyone heard of that term? Do you want to take a stab at it?
I have a sort of vague.
Well, it's okay. Try it. Try a vague.
Okay, ontological is sort of like ways of being.
Yeah.
And sort of like thinking about different ways of being. And so ontological pluralism, I guess, would be sort of making sure not to just center one experience perspective, but like you were saying, thinking of like, okay, we're building this oyster reef, like, are we making sure to think about what will actually benefit the oysters and sort of like their purpose in the,
Yes.
what they see their purpose.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that wasn't vague. That was spot on. Well done. Yeah, so ontological pluralism is about accepting that we don't know everything and that our perspective is situated in the knowledge, training, background, personal background, professional background that we have, and that therefore we only ever see the world as a thin slice of a fuller reality. And science, unfortunately, has been accused of being too fixed in only accepting scientific knowledge as the only kind of truth or the best, the most objective, sort of placing scientific knowledge on a higher pedestal than other forms of knowledge. And this is something that within the sciences, many scientists are now starting to change, to accept that other people and other non-humans have forms of knowledge that we should equally value along with Western scientific knowledge. And so I think this comes into play with nature-based solutions in that, especially if we're going for a more relational approach, we need to be more accepting of the ways of knowing that other actors that might be a part of that nature-based solution, other humans, other communities, other non-humans, how they see the issues at hand and how they might interact with the nature-based solution. I guess the third point is similar to relational approaches. So some scholars like here, Kyle White and Robin Wall-Kimmerer. Have any of you read either of their work? Oh, great, fabulous. Oh, a lot of people, excellent. So you'll know then that they talk about restoration as a way to repair relationships and repair injustices. So I think we have that opportunity with nature-based solutions to not just, protect ourselves from sea level rise. I mean, it's almost kind of sad to stop there, right? And only change that, but really to take the opportunity to change our wider culture, change our society, repair past harms, both to the environment, but also to each other. So I think nature-based solutions has so much more to offer if we are to think of it much more broadly than just fixing a problem, a kind of technological problem. There's also been I love this idea of a commons before the sea is an idea that isn't specific to nature-based solutions, but it's about making all of the US coast a public commons. And so what would it look like if we, at a federal level, just designated a certain width of the coast, say like 2 miles inland or more as just public lands. And we dedicate ourselves to restoring these lands for public recreation, for cultural, spiritual uses, for restoration. So that's an idea that's been floated as a response to sea level rise, because it's going to be so costly to protect every inch of shoreline. There's going to be a lot of unevenness in who can protect themselves and who can't, that maybe it should just be a federal project to restore these lands for the public good. So I love that idea. I don't know that it's very realistic in today's climate anyway, but it's a good one. And then finally, kind of related to White and Kimmerer is an idea of adaptation as part of climate reparation. So thinking about climate justice there. Climate justice, have any of you heard the term climate justice? So climate justice is the idea that justice for communities that are most impacted by climate change, who are the ones that are least responsible for it. So usually low-income communities, communities of color, the global south, are less responsible for climate change and are the ones who are suffering the most. And so perhaps there's a role to play in nature-based solutions also in the climate justice struggle. So I'll end with that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
In like, especially while reading the article before class, I was thinking a lot about, or I was reminded of like times that I've heard about, like sand nourishment and things before this. A lot of the time it's in the context of like preserving property value and things like that.
Yeah.
In conversations about nature-based solutions, how do you sort of like turn those conversations away from like preserving property value and that sort of short-sighted capitalistic lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a big issue in coastal adaptation. So there's a lot, I guess I could say about that. Taking a step back, I think that problem arises for two reasons. One is that private property is so enshrined and protected in American law and American psyche, like owning a home is such a part of American identity, right? That people just at an emotional level, a psychological level, are really attached to their property. We also protect private property to a much higher degree than other countries. So in the US, by federal law, if you there's something called a taking. So if a government or another party is infringing on the use of your property in some way that can be considered a taking. And you have the right to fight against that, and sue essentially. So this comes into play a lot with endangered species. There's been there was a lot of pushback when the Endangered Species Act first came on American law in the 70s, is that right? A lot of people argued that protecting endangered species on private property amounted to a taking because it was infringing the rights of homeowners to make the best and highest use of their land. And in some cases, I think they've won, and some they've lost. But this is an emerging issue for coastal adaptation as well, especially where governments see that it makes more financial sense to not, say, continue rebuilding properties or to continue to maintain seawalls where they're ultimately going to go away. Homeowners keep demanding that that infrastructure continue to be maintained. And they have a lot of kind of legal avenues to do so because American law protects private property so much. The other issue, though, coming not so much from the homeowner side, but from the local government side, is that we are a very decentralized governance system. In the US, other countries are much more centralized, where central government has more power. Here, local governments and state governments have comparatively more power than in other countries. So that means that, for example, tax revenue, cities depend on tax revenue a lot, because federal money doesn't flow in as great a quantities down to local levels as in other countries. So because cities depend so much on their own income sources to make money, often property taxes are the highest revenue source for a local government. And so if you start to threaten property values, either just by creating alarm due to sea level rise, or proclaiming that you, the government, are no longer going to maintain a certain roadway, or you're gonna put a moratorium on building in a certain area, that creates that will lower property values in the market, right? Because people know, oh, well, that neighborhood is not going to exist in 100 years or even sooner, or we can't build there anymore. So maybe the whole city's property values are affected. So from the government side, sometimes people don't want to create alarm and panic because they don't want to lose on property taxes, or they don't want to implement policies that's going to cost them property taxes. So there's a lot of incentives to keep the path dependency of continuing to protect properties, but that is changing now, in part because climate risks in some areas have been stronger than we anticipated. So we're getting stronger storms earlier than we thought we would in the century. But also because the market itself is changing a little bit. So maybe you've seen in the news that insurers, flood insurers around the US, are either greatly increasing their premiums for homeowners insurance for flood particularly, or just pulling out of certain states altogether. And this is creating a market response that has its own problems. But on the one hand, it's sort of making the cost of flood insurance more real. So flood insurance has maybe been artificially low in some areas that really where people should be more aware of flooding. The problem, though, is that it does mean that low-income homeowners aren't able to afford insurance anymore and have to go somewhere else if they even have the funds to do that. So there are some equity issues with that, but insurers, in their action, their private action as a industry, pulling out of certain markets or raising premiums is having an effect on property values and just local policy. So I think the situation is evolving quickly because we're kind of in a new world and we're not quite sure how things are going to go. But private industry is responding, and I think there is some push to make flood risks more, transparent in the housing market. So in a lot of states, if you own a house that is in a flood risk zone, you don't have to tell the buyer that that is the case. And so I know now there's laws to change that, where you have to disclose flood risks in certain states where you didn't have to before. So anyway, I think I'm rambling at this point, but I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thanks for interesting perspective on the complex topic, but I just want to add two other perspectives. And one
Yeah.
is, that doing nothing to mitigate, is also a choice, you know?
True, yeah.
And, you know, these are complex issues, but doing nothing amounts to a choice. Another angle is that, you emphasize the sea level rise prospects, but there's also a carbon storage angle to.
Oh,
the
yes,
question.
absolutely, yes. Thank you
So,
for bringing that up.
you know, that's just another potential positive, and in done certain ways, you could achieve some, mitigation of ocean acidification if you do that in certain ways. So I just want to toss those ideas out there that
Yes, thank
complement
you.
what you're saying, just a different perspective, yeah, additional perspectives to give.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the issue of carbon storage, which I'll confess I know very little about, but knowing wetlands, which is kind of the ecosystem I specialize in, what I do know is that carbon storage is very location specific and very variable in time, and that it can sometimes be hard to quantify the carbon storage, particularly over the long term of a system. But it is a major reason why people build nature-based solutions. So I am glad you brought that up. So carbon storage is one of the other motivations that people are driven by, in addition to shoreline protection and just general biodiversity and habitat protection benefits. And yeah, doing nothing is also an option. That's true. And some people, but I would say, I would maybe like nuance that by saying that in some cases, people have the choice to do nothing. And then in some cases, people won't have any choice at all, except to do nothing, because maybe they have no funds whatsoever to do anything. But yeah.
I guess what I meant by that is doing nothing is a choice that can have, when I say doing nothing to mitigate is a choice that can have negative impacts on
Mhm.
people. So it's complicated.
It's complicated, yeah. I think that's a good tagline for today. It's complicated.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speakers.
Okay, thank you.